Did you know that in 2011 a family in Brooklyn discovered their new apartment came with a previous tenant who had been dead for 3 years, and her ghost refused to leave because she was still waiting for someone who would never come back? This is the story of apartment 4B in a pre-war building on the edge of Prospect Park, where the living and the dead shared space for months before anyone realized what was happening, and where one woman's obsessive love transcended death itself, turning into something far darker and more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The Martinez family moved into the apartment on a crisp October morning in 2011. Roberto and Elena Martinez, both in their early 30s, had been searching for affordable housing in Brooklyn for months, and when they found the spacious 2-bedroom apartment with hardwood floors and original molding at a price that seemed too good to be true, they jumped at the opportunity without asking too many questions. Their 8-year-old daughter, Sophia, was excited about having her own room for the first time, and the family felt like their luck had finally turned after years of cramped living situations. The landlord, a heavyset man named Mr. Kowalski with nervous eyes and a tendency to avoid direct questions, handed over the keys with what seemed like excessive relief, muttering something about the previous tenant having moved out unexpectedly before hurrying away. The apartment had been empty for 6 months, he said, and had been thoroughly cleaned. What he didn't mention was why it had been so difficult to rent, why 3 previous families had broken their leases within weeks, or what had happened to the woman who had lived there before. The first night in the apartment was uneventful. The family unpacked boxes, arranged furniture, and fell asleep exhausted in their new home. But Sophia woke up at 3:17 a.m. to find a woman standing at the foot of her bed. The woman was young, maybe in her late 20s, with long dark hair and sad eyes that seemed to look through Sophia rather than at her. She wore a blue dress that might have been fashionable years ago, and she was completely still, not breathing, not moving, just staring at the window as if waiting for something. Sophia, groggy and confused, assumed she was dreaming. "Who are you?" she whispered. The woman didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge Sophia's presence. She just continued staring at the window with an expression of desperate longing that made Sophia feel uncomfortable in a way she couldn't quite explain. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Sophia fell back asleep, and when she woke up in the morning, the woman was gone. Sophia mentioned the dream to her mother at breakfast, describing the woman in the blue dress in vivid detail. Elena smiled and dismissed it as the product of an overactive imagination combined with the stress of moving to a new place. But that night, and every night after, the woman appeared again at exactly 3:17 a.m. Always in Sophia's room, always standing in the same spot, always staring at the window with that same expression of heartbreaking expectation. After a week of these nocturnal visits, Sophia stopped mentioning them to her parents. She somehow understood, with the intuitive wisdom children sometimes possess, that the woman wasn't dangerous. She was just sad, impossibly, unbearably sad. And she was waiting for someone who never came. But the woman didn't confine her presence to Sophia's room. Elena began noticing strange occurrences throughout the apartment. The bathroom mirror would fog up even when no one had showered, and words would appear in the condensation. "Where is he?" And "He promised," and sometimes just a name. "David." The kitchen faucet would turn on by itself in the middle of the night, running cold water that Elena would find flowing in the morning. And there was a smell, faint but persistent, of perfume that Elena didn't wear, a floral scent that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Roberto dismissed his wife's concerns at first, suggesting that old buildings had quirks, that the plumbing was probably faulty, that the mirror fogging was just condensation from temperature changes. But then he experienced something that shook his skepticism to its core. He came home late one night from his job as a security guard, around 2 a.m., and found a woman sitting in their living room in the dark. She was facing away from him, sitting in Elena's favorite chair, her long dark hair visible in the dim light from the street lamps outside. Roberto's first thought was that Elena had waited up for him and fallen asleep in the chair. But Elena was smaller than this woman, and her hair was shorter. "Hello?" Roberto called out, his hand reaching for the light switch, his heart beginning to pound with the realization that a stranger was in his home. The woman didn't move, didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge him at all. Roberto flipped the light switch, and in the sudden brightness, the chair was empty. There was no one there, no one in the room at all. But the cushion of the chair was depressed, as if someone had just been sitting in it, and when Roberto approached, he could feel residual warmth, as if a body had been there only moments before. That's when the Martinez family started asking questions about the apartment's history. They talked to neighbors, visited the local library to search through old newspapers, and gradually a tragic story emerged. The apartment had previously been occupied by a woman named Catherine Walsh, age 29, an aspiring artist who had moved to Brooklyn from Ohio 3 years earlier to pursue her dreams. She had fallen deeply, obsessively in love with a man named David Chun, a photographer she'd met at a gallery opening. Their relationship had been intense and tumultuous, marked by passionate reunions and dramatic breakups. David had commitment issues, Catherine had abandonment issues, and together they created a toxic cycle that neither seemed able to escape. In March of 2008, after one of their breakups, David told Catherine he needed space, that he was going to California for a few months to clear his head and figure out what he wanted. He promised he would come back, promised they would talk when he returned, promised he wouldn't just disappear from her life. Catherine believed him. She waited in the apartment, convinced that any day he would walk through the door, that he would come back to her the way he always had before. But David never came back. He moved to San Francisco, started a new life, and stopped responding to Catherine's increasingly desperate calls and emails. And Catherine, unable to accept that he had abandoned her, unable to process that the promises had been lies, continued waiting. She stopped going out. She stopped working. She stopped eating regularly. Her entire existence became focused on the moment when David would return and they would be together again. The neighbors remembered seeing her sometimes, standing at her window at all hours, watching the street below, waiting for David to appear. They remembered the mail piling up outside her door, the concerned knocking that went unanswered, the growing worry that something was very wrong. In June of 2008, 3 months after David had left, the landlord entered the apartment after neighbors reported a terrible smell. He found Catherine's body in the bedroom, dead for at least a week from what the medical examiner would later determine was self-neglect leading to multiple organ failure. She had essentially stopped taking care of herself to the point where her body simply gave up. But what haunted everyone who saw the scene was her position. She had died sitting in a chair by the window, her body slumped forward, her eyes still open and fixed on the street below, still waiting for someone who would never come. The apartment had been cleaned and rented several times since Catherine's death, but no tenant stayed long. They all reported the same phenomena: the woman in the blue dress appearing at night, the messages in the bathroom mirror, the overwhelming sense of sadness that permeated the space, and most disturbing of all, the feeling of being watched by someone whose grief was so profound it had become poisonous. Armed with this knowledge, Elena tried to communicate with Catherine's ghost. She spoke aloud to the empty apartment, explaining gently that David wasn't coming back, that Catherine needed to let go and move on. But the ghostly manifestations only intensified. The woman appeared more frequently, no longer just at 3:17 a.m., but at random times throughout the day and night. Objects began moving on their own. Photographs would be found face down. Doors would slam without drafts, and Sophia reported that the woman would sometimes sit on the edge of her bed, crying silently, her shoulders shaking with sobs that made no sound. Then things took a darker turn. The messages in the mirror changed from sad to angry, "P.S. mine, and make them leave, and this is my home." Elena began waking up with unexplained bruises on her arms, as if someone had grabbed her during the night. Roberto reported feeling invisible hands pushing him when he walked down the hallway. And Sophia, who had initially felt sympathy for the ghost, became terrified. When the woman started appearing directly in front of her, her sad eyes now filled with rage, her mouth opening in a silent scream that Sophia could somehow hear inside her head. The Martinez family sought help from a local priest who agreed to perform a blessing on the apartment. But during the ceremony, the phenomena escalated to a terrifying climax. Every mirror in the apartment shattered simultaneously. Photographs flew off the walls, and the temperature dropped so dramatically that their breath became visible. The priest, visibly shaken, reported feeling an overwhelming presence of rage and despair, a spirit so consumed by obsession that it had become malevolent. "She doesn't want to leave," the priest told them, packing up his holy water and cross with shaking hands. "She's convinced that if she leaves, she'll never see him again. Her love has curdled into something toxic. She's not just haunting this apartment, she's claiming it. She thinks this is where she belongs, where she has to be when he finally returns, and nothing I can do will convince her otherwise." The family made the difficult decision to break their lease and move out, despite the financial hardship it would cause. Mr. Kowalski, the landlord, didn't even try to stop them. He'd been through this too many times before. He knew the apartment was cursed, knew that Catherine Walsh's ghost was trapped in an endless loop of waiting and watching and hoping for a reunion that would never happen. But here's where the story takes its most disturbing turn. Elena, feeling guilty about abandoning Catherine's ghost to her eternal vigil, decided to track down David Chun. She found him living in San Francisco, now married with a child, working as a successful commercial photographer. She called him, explained the situation, and asked if he would be willing to return to the apartment, to speak to Catherine's ghost, to release her from her obsession by making it clear that he had moved on. David's response was cold and dismissive. "That's crazy," he said. "I didn't love her. It was just a fling that got out of hand. She was too intense, too needy. I told her I was leaving because I wanted her to take the hint and move on. I never promised to come back. Whatever she convinced herself, I said, it was in her head. And I'm not going back to Brooklyn to talk to a ghost. Tell her to leave me alone, even in death." Elena reported this conversation to a paranormal researcher who had become interested in the case. The researcher visited the apartment, now empty again after the Martinez family's departure, and attempted to communicate with Catherine's ghost using various methods. During an FP session, they captured audio that seemed to be a woman's voice saying, "He promised me, he loved me. I just have to wait." The researcher tried to explain that David had denied ever promising to return, that his feelings had never been as deep as hers, that she was holding on to a fantasy rather than a reality. But the response they recorded was chilling. "Liar, you're all liars. When he comes back, he'll explain everything. I just have to wait here. I have to be here when he comes through that door." The apartment remains empty to this day. Mr. Kowalski has given up trying to rent it. It sits dark and silent, apartment 4B in a building full of life. A void space where one woman, as obsessive love, has created a prison from which she refuses to escape. But the most disturbing part of this story isn't what's happening in the apartment. It's what happened 6 months after the Martinez family moved out. David Chen was visiting New York on business and, out of morbid curiosity, decided to drive past the building in Brooklyn where Catherine had died. He didn't plan to go inside, didn't plan to confront the ghost his ex-girlfriend had become. He just wanted to see the place, to confirm in his own mind that all of this was nonsense. But his car broke down right in front of the building. As he waited for a tow truck, he looked up at the windows of apartment 4B and saw a woman standing there, backlit by the street lamps, her long dark hair unmistakable even from the street. She was looking right at him, and even from that distance, David could see the expression on her face, not joy at his return, but something darker, something that looked like triumph mixed with rage. David's phone rang. It was an unknown number. Against his better judgment, he answered. A woman's voice, distorted and crackling with static, whispered, "You came back. You finally came back. Now you can never leave." David threw the phone away in horror and ran from the scene, abandoning his broken-down car. He took the next flight back to San Francisco and refuses to speak about the incident. But according to his wife, he's changed since that night. He wakes up at 3:17 a.m. every night, convinced he hears someone calling his name. He sees a woman in a blue dress and reflections in mirrors and windows and puddles on the street. And no matter where he goes, he smells that same floral perfume, faint but persistent, a reminder that some promises, even those we never made, can bind us across the boundary between life and death. Apartment 4B remains empty, but neighbors report that lights sometimes turn on in the middle of the night, and if you stand on the street below and look up at the window, you can still see a figure standing there waiting, watching, convinced that the person she loved will walk through the door at any moment. Catherine Walsh has been dead for over a decade now, but her ghost continues its vigil, trapped in a moment of anticipation that will never reach resolution, loving someone who never loved her back with an intensity that transcended death and became something far more terrible than love ever should be. So here's the question that keeps paranormal researchers awake at night. What happens when someone dies while clinging to a delusion so powerful that reality itself becomes irrelevant? Can a ghost be reasoned with, or is Catherine's spirit simply running a program that can never be interrupted, forever waiting for a reunion that exists only in her mind? And most terrifying of all is David Chun actually being haunted by Catherine's ghost reaching across the country to find him, or has his guilt and horror created its own psychological prison from which he'll never escape? The apartment is still there, still empty, still waiting. And if you're ever in Brooklyn, walking through Prospect Park on a quiet night, you might find yourself passing that pre-war building with its darkened windows. And if you look up at apartment 4B, you might see a figure standing at the window watching the street below with desperate hope, waiting for someone who will never return, loving someone who was never worth loving, trapped forever in the most terrible kind of hell, one created not by demons or devils, but by the simple human act of refusing to accept that love, no matter how intense, is not always enough.